Here to discuss the economic trends, the brands to watch, and the social movements that will have impact are Dr. Mzukisi, who's a renowned political economist and also the author of The Fall of the ANC, What Next? We also have Thebe Ikalafeng. He's the founder of Brand Leadership Africa and has been a consultant to many African governments and leaders. And finally, we have Dion Chang, who is a scenario planner and a strategist and the founder of Flux Trends. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Dr. Gobo, let's start with you. The IMF says emerging markets will see a pickup. A handful of economists say there'll be a recession. What's it going to be, recession or pickup?
Well, I would like to go with the optimistic scenario of the IMF. I think we've had, the worst year in the past year, and emerging markets have had a difficult time. This would be the fifth consecutive time that we've seen a slump in the emerging markets. We saw in the first half of the past year China going through an economic slump, which affected other countries, developing countries that trade with it, especially African economies. So I think we are going to see a multi-speed pickup in emerging markets.
So if there is a slight recovery and China could be at the center of it, what are the variables that will cause that to be? Because in 2015 was the slowing of the Chinese economy, and we saw what that did to the entire world spectrum.
For many countries in Africa, it's macroeconomic reforms, starting political stability and getting their economies on the right track.
Many of the leading African countries, the ones that showed promise, really took a hit with the downturn in the commodities cycle. Will there be an improvement?
There are a number of African economies that are going to, where we're going to see resurgence, that are not so much dependent on commodities. Countries such as Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, commodity-dependent country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, surprisingly, is in this list because of macroeconomic reforms and improving conditions for doing business. Tanzania, a few countries in Southern Africa are going to see an upward trajectory.
Gentlemen, what do you make of what's been said about the economic scenarios ahead of us in 2016?
If I put my futurist hat on, the one country that really shines above the rest is a country like Rwanda, who in 2015 announced that they were building the first drone port, the first global drone port there. And, drones, we're still struggling with the legislation. So for a country to stake a claim so far in the future as a long-term trajectory, for me, that's a really shining example of amazing foresight.
The biggest challenge in Africa is intra-Africa investments, and at 12 to 15% across the continent compared to 40 in North America, 60 in Europe. We can do better by serving Africa ourselves.
Let's turn our attention now to marketing and branding trends. Thebe Ikalafeng, in terms of branding and messaging for Africa in 2016, how does the continent sell itself?
I say 2016 we're speaking entrepreneurship. For me, that is what Africa is about. You look at what Tony Elumelu is doing in Nigeria with the Tony Elumelu Entrepreneurship Program, trying to create 1,000 entrepreneurs, investing $100 million in the initiative. We are speaking entrepreneurship. You're looking at South Africa trying to create 100 industrialists in 3 years. You are speaking entrepreneurship. You're looking at Dangote putting $500 million in Ethiopia in a cement plant. You are seeing entrepreneurship. To me, the overriding a message about Africa, this Africa that everybody says is rising, is entrepreneurship.
So also 2015 was the year we saw the disruptor companies, Uber. Which other companies are really going to be the ones to watch, the dynamic ones?
You spoke earlier to Mzukisi about Africa's reliance on commodities, but you've also seen a greater shift now into retail, into financial services, and in retail, particularly in e-commerce. Look at a young brand like Iswara, and Iswara is a small tea brand from Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, which has now just listed in self-register in London and is available in about 11 countries in the continent. You're seeing a brand like Tiosan, which is a fragrance brand by Magatte Wade from Senegal. So I love the young brands because the big brands will be there.
Those are the good news stories. What about the challenges? Companies that have really encountered real difficulties in 2015, the mines, the oil and gas companies, will there be a recovery for them? What are the prospects for them?
Well, let's start with the most admired brand in Africa, MTN. MTN operating in 17 countries, serving 250 million consumers. The Nigerian, I think, is really a setback to the brand. $5.2 billion fine, which has now been reduced by 20-25%. I think MTN is really going to reassert itself, reimagine itself, and recreate itself. To me, that's the brands that we really need to be looking at. Of course, the mining brands have to redefine themselves. As you've mentioned, whether it's Lonman, whether it's Anglo, all of them are shedding employees. So it means they're going to have to redefine themselves. Are they employee-intensive mines, or is there another way to do mining other than reliance on manual labor?
Gentlemen, what's your view? We've often heard that there's a need to create African champions, these African brands that can take on the world.
Starting to see what is happening globally. There's a complete disruption, especially in the entertainment and broadcasting and telecommunications world. The lines are getting completely blurred of who actually does what. But if you look at one of the bigger brands, so a brand like Safaricom, but what they've done is they've also entered into the pay TV space. So they've recently, in 2015, released what they call the black box, which is a decoder, but it has a SIM card embedded in it, which gives the family the connectivity, up to 10 people, data connectivity. So you're blurring the lines between entertainment and broadband and data access.
We are likely to see a lot of creative destruction because bigger companies tend to move slow, and I think you are going to see a wave of entrepreneurship in the continent. Smaller, medium-sized, agile companies that are consumer interfacing. A lot of them within the space of ICT, new e-commerce platforms, as well as also within the space of the food value chain, because you have a greater focus to feeding Africa. You have a greater focus to channeling investments into Africa's agriculture.
Let's discuss social movements. We have seen from Burundi to Burkina Faso, young people agitating for a change in political leadership, no more third terms for presidents, for free education, for employment opportunities. Young people want to be heard. Is that voice going to get louder?
Absolutely. When you come to the socio and political debates, that gets really, really interesting, because then there's another convergence with cheaper broadband, with more connectivity and more Wi-Fi. You're getting people get more traction onto social media, and as we know, we've seen with Arab Spring and the rest of the unrest in the continent and elsewhere in the world, that is really, really where it starts growing. So people get mobilized really quickly, and it's very, very interesting. If you look at the average age of sub-Saharan Africa, it's actually in your teens, so you're 15 to 17. And it's interesting to see what those the main causes of concern are, and they're quite different from probably previous generations. And the main concerns really are terrorism, corruption, and unemployment.
If you're a company targeting a young demographic, what are the instruments you should be using?
Absolutely, it's social media, and we're moving also into a hypervisual era very, very, very fast. And in 2015, you even saw that the Oxford Dictionary used an emoticon as word of the year. So they're not even using an actual written word as the word of the year, which just signifies that we're starting to do things a lot more visually, communicate visually, and also on video.
Gentlemen, who are the young Africans, or indeed just Africans, we should be watching in 2016?
Well, I think it is not an individual person, but it is the young African. And I think a couple of things about them which is quite interesting is they are not loyal. When we were growing up loyalty to party, loyalty to brands, they are not loyal. They want instant gratification. And they are engaging.
We're not going to see a heroic expression of a leader, a young leader or an entrepreneur. But we're going to see a lot of networks, people working through networks. There will be individuals, of course, but there will be a lot more churning out of young entrepreneurs going forward.
If you look at resistance movements in the last couple of years, the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong, Occupy Wall Street, these have happened organically, and it's not one. It's only a leader emerges only after the fact of things. So it's going to be an interesting thing where there's a tipping point just is reached, and then suddenly a leader will emerge. And what's happening is we are grooming our leaders already. So you've got entities like Bright Young Minds or the African Leadership Academy who are already looking at Pan-Africa and looking at for the best minds, and the future looks bright.